What if a detective's most important case wasn't about solving a crime, but protecting a secret act of kindness? In the shadows of a rain-soaked alley, something unexpected is discovered, and it changes everything. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The rain fell in steady sheets against the cobblestones of Boston's Beacon Hill, turning the gas-lit streets into mirrors of amber light. It was the autumn of 1897, and Detective Thomas Ashford stood beneath the awning of a modest bakery, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wet pavement. At 32 years of age, Thomas had earned a reputation as one of the city's most intuitive investigators, a solitary man who preferred the company of unsolved cases to that of his colleagues at the police headquarters. His dark hair, perpetually disheveled despite his best efforts, framed a face marked by strong features and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through the facades people wore like Sunday clothes. Thomas pulled his pocket watch from his waistcoat, noting the hour with a frown. 9:30 in the evening, and he was no closer to understanding the peculiar case that had landed on his desk 3 days prior. A series of small thefts had been reported throughout the neighborhood, nothing of significant monetary value, but the pattern troubled him. Food items, primarily bread and preserved goods, had been disappearing from various establishments with such regularity that it suggested desperation rather than criminal intent. As he contemplated his next move, the door of the bakery behind him opened with a gentle chime. Thomas turned, instinctively stepping aside to allow passage, and found himself facing a woman whose beauty struck him with unexpected force. She stood in the doorway, a woven basket clutched in her gloved hands, her chestnut hair pinned elegantly beneath a modest hat that bore signs of careful maintenance rather than recent purchase. Her eyes, a remarkable shade of green that reminded Thomas of summer leaves, widened slightly as they met his gaze. "Forgive me," she said softly, her voice carrying the refined accent of proper education. "I did not mean to startle you." Thomas removed his hat, a gesture of respect that came naturally despite his usual reticence around strangers. "Not at all, madam. The fault is mine for blocking the entrance. The rain has made a refuge of every doorway." A faint smile touched her lips, though Thomas noticed it did not quite reach her eyes. There was a sadness there, carefully concealed but unmistakable to someone trained in observation. She was perhaps 28, wearing a black dress that spoke of mourning, though the fabric showed signs of having been turned and restitched to extend its serviceability. "Indeed it has," she replied, glancing up at the persistent downpour. "Though I confess I have always found something rather peaceful about the rain. It washes the city clean, if only temporarily." Before Thomas could respond, the baker, a rotund man named Mr. Peterson, appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Catherine Winters," he said warmly. "I've wrapped your order as requested. 3 loaves, as always." He handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle, which she placed carefully in her basket. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Your kindness is, as ever, greatly appreciated." Catherine reached into her small purse, but the baker waved his hand dismissively. "No, no, my dear. Your late husband was a good man who helped me when times were difficult. Consider this a small repayment of that debt." Thomas observed the exchange with interest, noting the way Catherine's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of her husband, and how her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as she closed her purse. She thanked the baker once more and stepped out into the rain, raising a simple umbrella that had seen better days. Something compelled Thomas to follow. Perhaps it was the way she had appeared so suddenly, or the mention of the bread, or simply the mysterious quality that seemed to surround her like morning mist. He fell into step several paces behind her, his long coat providing some protection from the elements as he watched her navigate the wet streets with practiced ease. Catherine walked with purpose through the lamplit avenues, turning onto progressively quieter streets until she reached a narrow alley between 2 brick buildings. Thomas hung back, concealing himself in the shadow of a doorway, as he watched her pause at the entrance to the alley. She glanced around, her movements nervous and cautious, before disappearing into the darkness. His detective's instincts fully aroused, Thomas waited a moment before following. The alley was poorly lit, with only the faint glow from nearby windows to guide his steps. He moved quietly, years of experience making his footfalls nearly silent despite the puddles that dotted the uneven ground. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he could make out Catherine's silhouette ahead, kneeling beside what appeared to be a collection of crates and discarded furniture. Then he heard voices, small and tentative, children's voices. "Mrs. Winters, did you bring the bread?" a young voice asked, high-pitched with hope and hunger. "Yes, sweetheart," Catherine replied, her tone infinitely gentle. "I have enough for all of you tonight. Come, let us share it before it grows too cold." Thomas stepped closer, careful to remain hidden, and what he saw made his chest tighten with an emotion he had not felt in years. 5 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12, emerged from a makeshift shelter constructed from wooden pallets and tattered canvas. They were thin, their clothes worn and insufficient for the October chill, but their faces lit with genuine joy as Catherine unwrapped the loaves and began breaking them into portions. "Now, we must make this last," she instructed gently, handing each child a piece. "Eat slowly and savor every bite. Tomorrow evening, I shall return with more." "You're like an angel, Mrs. Winters," said a girl of about 10, her dark eyes shining with gratitude. "An angel who comes in the rain." Catherine laughed softly, though Thomas could hear the catch in her voice. "No angel, child. Simply someone who remembers what it is to be hungry and cold. Simply someone who cannot turn away from those in need." As Thomas watched, Catherine remained with the children for nearly an hour, speaking with them about their days, checking their makeshift shelter for leaks, and ensuring each child had eaten their share. She produced a small tin from her basket, revealing it to contain coins that she counted carefully before distributing among the older children with instructions on how to stretch the money for necessities. It was only when she finally rose to leave, her basket now empty, that Thomas understood. The thefts, the missing bread and preserved goods, they were not thefts at all. Or rather, they were acts of theft committed not out of criminal intent, but out of compassion. Catherine Winters had been taking only what she could afford to purchase or what was freely given, then redistributing it to those who had nothing. But as she turned to leave the alley, another figure stepped from the shadows on the opposite end. Thomas tensed, recognizing the uniform of a city patrolman, and his heart sank as he realized the officer had also been following Catherine. "Well, well," the patrolman said, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. "Mrs.
Catherine Winters, I believe. I've been watching you for some time now, madam. These children are vagrants, and you have been harboring them, which is against city ordinances. Furthermore, I have reason to believe you have been involved in the procurement of goods through less than legal means." Catherine's face paled in the dim light, but she stood her ground with remarkable composure. "These children are orphans, officer. They have nowhere to go, and no one to care for them. I have done only what any Christian person should do: provide food and comfort to those in need. The law does not distinguish between charity and criminal activity when it comes to vagrancy, Mrs. Winters. You will need to come with me to the station. As for these children, they will be taken to the workhouse where they belong." The children cried out in protest, clustering around Catherine's skirts as she placed protective hands on their shoulders. Thomas saw her expression shift from fear to fierce determination, and in that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He stepped forward into the light, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Officer," he said calmly, pulling his identification from his coat pocket. "Detective Thomas Ashford, Special Investigations Division. I believe there has been a misunderstanding." The patrolman straightened, clearly uncertain how to proceed. "Detective Ashford, sir. I was not aware this case had been assigned to your division." "It has been under my observation for several days," Thomas replied smoothly, the lie forming with surprising ease. "Mrs. Winters has been assisting me with an investigation into the welfare of displaced children in this district. Her actions have been performed under official sanction as part of gathering evidence for a larger inquiry into the inadequacies of our current municipal care system." Catherine's eyes met his across the dim alley, wide with surprise and confusion, but she remained silent, her intelligence telling her to trust this unexpected intervention. The patrolman frowned, clearly disappointed at having his arrest thwarted. "I see. I was not informed of any such investigation, sir. The nature of the inquiry requires discretion," Thomas said firmly. "You have done your duty in monitoring suspicious activity, officer, and your diligence is noted. However, I must ask you to leave Mrs. Winters and these children to my supervision. You may file your report with your captain, and I shall ensure he receives a full explanation of the circumstances." After a moment's hesitation,
The patrolman nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. As you wish, detective. Good evening. He tipped his hat and departed, his footsteps echoing on the wet stones as he disappeared into the night. Silence fell over the alley, broken only by the soft patter of rain and the anxious breathing of the children. Catherine continued to stare at Thomas, her expression a mixture of relief, confusion, and wariness. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Though I confess I do not understand why you helped us. You are a detective. You could have arrested me yourself." Thomas replaced his identification in his pocket and approached slowly, not wishing to frighten the children who watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. "I could have," he agreed. "But I saw no criminal here tonight, Mrs. Winters. Only a woman with a kind heart trying to help those whom society has forgotten." "But you lied to that officer," Catherine said, though there was no accusation in her tone, only curiosity. "You invented an investigation that does not exist." A wry smile touched Thomas's lips. "I did, though perhaps it should exist. Tell me, Mrs. Winters, how long have you been caring for these children?" Catherine glanced down at the young faces surrounding her, her expression softening with obvious affection. 3 months, perhaps longer for some. They find their way to me, or I find them. This city has so many forgotten souls, detective. Children whose parents have died or abandoned them, who slipped through the cracks of institutions that are already overcrowded and underfunded. I do what little I can. "And where do you live? How do you support this charity?" She hesitated before answering, as if deciding whether to trust him. "I have a small apartment on Charles Street, modest but adequate. My husband, God rest his soul, was a school teacher. He passed away 2 years ago from pneumonia. He left me with little in terms of money, but he taught me the value of education and compassion. I take in mending work and give piano lessons to support myself. What little extra I have, I share with these children." Thomas looked at the children again, noting their thin faces and inadequate clothing. 5 mouths to feed, even partially, would strain any modest income. "And tonight, the bread from Mr. Peterson? He gives it to me freely, from yesterday's baking that would otherwise go to waste," Catherine explained. "I would never steal, Detective Ashford. I purchase what I can afford and accept only what is offered willingly. These children deserve to eat, to be warm, to know that someone in this world cares whether they live or die." The passion in her voice stirred something in Thomas's chest, an emotion he had long ago learned to suppress in favor of logic and reason. He studied her face in the dim light, seeing not just beauty but strength, determination, and a goodness that seemed almost foreign in his world of crime and corruption. "I understand," Thomas said quietly, the words emerging with a sincerity that surprised even himself. The phrase would echo in his mind for days to come, marking the moment when his carefully constructed solitary existence began to crack open like ice beneath spring sun. Catherine tilted her head slightly, studying him with those remarkable green eyes that seemed to perceive far more than he was comfortable revealing. "Do you truly, Detective Ashford? Most men in your position would see only lawlessness and disorder. They would see these children as problems to be removed rather than souls to be saved." "Perhaps I am not most men," Thomas replied, then immediately felt foolish for such a presumptuous statement. He cleared his throat, returning to more practical matters. "However, we now face a complication. I have told a lie to a fellow officer, which means I must either make that lie true or risk serious consequences for both of us. That patrolman will file his report, and questions will be asked." Catherine's expression shifted to concern, her hand moving protectively to rest on the shoulder of the nearest child, a boy of perhaps 8 with sandy hair and wide, frightened eyes. "I will not allow these children to be taken to the workhouse, Detective. I have seen what becomes of children in such places. They are worked until their spirits break, fed barely enough to survive, and treated as less than human. If you must arrest me to satisfy the law, then do so. But please, I beg you, let me find proper homes for these little ones first." The desperation in her voice cut through Thomas's professional detachment like a knife through silk. He found himself stepping closer, drawn by an impulse he could not quite name. "I have no intention of arresting you, Mrs. Winters, nor of allowing these children to be sent to the workhouse. But we must act quickly and carefully. The lie I told tonight buys us time, perhaps a week at most, before my superiors begin asking questions about this supposed investigation." "Then what do you propose?" Catherine asked, hope flickering in her eyes like candlelight in darkness. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his mind working through possibilities with the same methodical precision he applied to solving cases. The rain continued its steady drumming on the rooftops above, and somewhere in the distance, a clock tower chimed 10 o'clock. I propose we make my fabrication a reality, a genuine investigation into the welfare systems of this city, with documented evidence and proper procedures. And while we conduct this investigation, we find legitimate solutions for these children, proper homes with families who will care for them, or at the very least, better accommodations than this alley. You would do this? Catherine's voice was barely audible, thick with emotion. You would risk your career, your reputation for children you do not know and a woman you met mere moments ago. Thomas met her gaze directly, and in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their vastly different circumstances. I became a detective because I believed in justice, Mrs. Winters. True justice, not merely the enforcement of laws that sometimes fail to account for human compassion and necessity. These children deserve better than what this city offers them. You deserve better than to live in fear of arrest for the crime of kindness. If I can use my position to effect real change, then perhaps my career will finally mean something beyond filing reports and catching pickpockets. The children had been listening to this exchange with rapt attention, their young faces reflecting confusion, hope, and lingering fear. The girl who had called Catherine an angel spoke up, her voice small but brave. Does this mean we can stay together? That Mrs. Winters won't be taken away? Thomas knelt down, bringing himself to the child's eye level, his long coat spreading around him like dark wings. What is your name, young lady? Sarah, sir. Sarah Miller. I'm 10 years old. Well, Sarah Miller, I give you my word as a gentleman and as an officer of the law that I will do everything in my power to ensure your safety and that of your friends here. Mrs. Winters will not be arrested, and you will not be separated unless proper. Loving homes can be found for each of you. Do you trust me? Sarah looked to Catherine, who nodded encouragingly, then back to Thomas. Yes, sir. Mrs. Winters says we should always trust our instincts about people, and my instincts say you're a good man, even if you do look terribly serious and somewhat frightening. A genuine laugh escaped Thomas, surprising everyone present, including himself. It had been so long since he had laughed with real amusement that the sound felt foreign in his own throat. I have been told I possess an unfortunately severe countenance. I shall endeavor to smile more often in your presence, Miss Miller, so as not to frighten you. Catherine watched this interaction with visible emotion, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. When Thomas rose and turned back to her, she quickly looked away, composing herself. You have already done more than I could have hoped for, Detective Ashford. I do not know how to adequately express my gratitude. Then do not try, Thomas said gently. Instead, tell me everything about these children, their names, their circumstances, how they came to be alone in this city. If we are to build a legitimate case for reform, we must document their stories properly. Every detail matters. They spent the next hour in that dim alley, with Catherine recounting the history of each child, while Thomas took meticulous notes in a small leather journal he produced from his coat pocket. There was Sarah, whose parents had died in a factory fire 6 months prior, leaving her with no relatives willing to take her in. The sandy-haired boy was Michael O'Brien, age 8, whose father had been a dock worker killed in an accident and whose mother had subsequently disappeared, likely driven to desperate measures by poverty and grief. Twin brothers Robert and William Fletcher, age 7, had been abandoned outside a church by parents who could no longer feed them, and the youngest, a small girl of perhaps 6 named Emma, had been found wandering the streets, too traumatized or too young to explain how she came to be alone. As Catherine spoke, Thomas found himself increasingly affected by these stories of loss and abandonment. He had seen much suffering in his years as a detective, but there was something particularly piercing about the plight of these innocent children, cast aside by a society that prided itself on progress and civilization. And there was something equally affecting about Catherine herself, this widow who possessed so little yet gave so much, who faced potential arrest with courage and dignity, who loved these children as if they were her own. Where do they sleep when the weather is truly terrible? Thomas asked, noting the inadequacy of the makeshift shelter. Catherine hesitated, then admitted quietly, Sometimes when it is very cold or the rain is particularly severe, I bring them to my apartment. I know it is dangerous, that discovery could mean eviction or worse, but I cannot bear the thought of them freezing in the night. Your apartment is small, you said? 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen, hardly adequate for 5 children and myself, but we manage. They sleep on the floor, wrapped in what blankets I can spare, and leave before dawn so the other tenants do not notice. Thomas shook his head, marveling at her resourcefulness and dedication. This cannot continue as it is. Even if we avoid legal trouble, the situation is unsustainable. The children need proper shelter, regular meals, education, and medical care. You need support, both financial and practical. I am well aware of the inadequacies of our arrangement, Detective, Catherine said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her tone. But I work with what resources I have. If you have better suggestions, I am listening. I do, actually, Thomas replied, his mind already formulating a plan. But it will require trust and cooperation between us. Tomorrow I want you to come to my office at police headquarters. We will begin the official investigation I promised, complete with proper documentation. I will also contact some acquaintances who work with charitable organizations in the city. There are people, good people, who might be willing to help if they knew the full extent of the situation. Catherine looked uncertain, clearly unaccustomed to accepting help. I do not wish to be a burden or a charity case myself, Detective Ashford. You would not be. You would be a crucial witness and participant in an official investigation. Any assistance rendered would be in service of that investigation. Thomas paused, then added more softly, and perhaps, if I may speak plainly, you might allow yourself to accept help not as charity but as partnership. You have been fighting this battle alone for too long, Mrs. Winters. Let someone stand beside you. The vulnerability that flashed across Catherine's face in that moment struck Thomas with unexpected force. He realized that beneath her composure and determination, she was exhausted, carrying burdens that would have crushed a lesser person. I am not accustomed to depending on others, she admitted. My husband's death taught me that the only person I can truly rely upon is myself. That is a harsh lesson and not entirely accurate, Thomas said, though I understand why you might have learned it. I too have lived a solitary existence, trusting few and depending on fewer still. But perhaps we are both wrong to be so isolated. Perhaps there is strength in alliance that neither of us has allowed ourselves to experience. Catherine studied him for a long moment, and Thomas felt the weight of her assessment. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him, this tall, serious detective who had inserted himself into her life so suddenly. Did she see a potential ally, or simply another complication? Did she sense, as he did, that something significant was beginning between them, something that transcended the immediate crisis with the children? Very well, Catherine said finally. I will come to your office tomorrow afternoon. But I must ask, Detective Ashford, why are you really doing this? You said you believe in justice, and I do not doubt your sincerity, but there is something more, is there not? Some personal reason that drives you to help us? Thomas was silent for a moment, surprised by her perceptiveness. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain carefully controlled. When I was 12 years old, my younger sister died of scarlet fever. We were not poor, not by the standards of most, but my father had lost his position, and we could not afford proper medical care. I watched her suffer, watched my parents' helplessness, and I vowed that if I ever had the power to prevent such suffering in others, I would use it. I became a detective thinking I could make a difference through enforcing the law, but I have learned that sometimes the law itself is insufficient. Sometimes justice requires us to act outside the strict boundaries of regulation and procedure. Understanding and compassion filled Catherine's eyes. I am sorry for your loss, Detective. Such pain never truly leaves us, does it? It simply becomes part of who we are. No, it does not leave us. But perhaps we can transform it into something meaningful, channel it toward helping others avoid similar pain. Thomas closed his notebook and returned it to his pocket. It is late, and these children need rest. Can you get them safely to your apartment tonight? Yes. The route I take is largely unobserved at this hour. We have learned to move quietly through the city. Then do so, and be careful. That patrolman may be watching, despite my warnings. Tomorrow, come to headquarters at 2 o'clock. Ask for me specifically, and we will begin the official work. Thomas turned to leave, then paused. Mrs. Winters, I meant what I said earlier. I understand. I understand your determination to help these children, your willingness to risk everything for their welfare, and your fear of trusting others. I understand because I have lived my life by similar principles. though perhaps with less nobility of purpose. Whatever comes next, whatever obstacles we face, you will not face them alone. Catherine's response was barely a whisper, but it carried across the space between them with perfect clarity. Thank you, Detective Ashford. More than you know. The following afternoon arrived with unexpected sunshine, as if the heavens themselves approved of the path Thomas and Catherine had chosen. Thomas sat at his desk in the modest office he maintained at police headquarters, reviewing the notes he had compiled the previous night. He had barely slept, his mind too occupied with formulating a strategy that would satisfy his superiors, while genuinely helping Catherine and the children. The lies he had told weighed on his conscience, not because he regretted them, but because he knew that lies, even well-intentioned ones, had a way of unraveling at the most inconvenient moments. A knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. "Come in," he called, straightening the papers on his desk. Catherine entered, and Thomas found himself momentarily struck anew by her appearance. In the daylight streaming through his office window, she was even more beautiful than she had been in the dim alley. She wore the same black morning dress, but she had clearly taken great care with her appearance. Her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant style that must have taken considerable time. There was a dignity in her bearing that spoke of better circumstances in her past, of a woman who had known comfort before fate had dealt her cruel blows. "Detective Ashford," she greeted him with a small curtsy, her gloved hands clasped nervously before her. "I hope I am not tardy." The trolley was delayed. Thomas rose immediately, moving around his desk to pull out a chair for her. "You are perfectly punctual, Mrs. Winters. Please, sit. May I offer you tea? I can have some brought up from the commissary." "That is very kind, but unnecessary. I would prefer we proceed directly to business, if that is acceptable." Catherine settled into the chair with unconscious grace, though Thomas noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted around his office as if cataloging potential threats. "Of course." Thomas returned to his own chair, opening the leather-bound notebook that now contained detailed information about each of the 5 children. "I have spent the morning researching charitable organizations and private individuals who might be willing to assist us. I believe I have identified 3 potential avenues of support." Catherine leaned forward slightly, hope and apprehension mingling in her expression. "So quickly? I confess I am impressed, Detective. Time is of the essence. The longer we delay, the more opportunity there is for our arrangement to be questioned." Thomas consulted his notes. "First, there is the Beacon Hill Ladies Benevolent Society, a group of wealthy women who fund various charitable endeavors throughout the city. They have established several homes for orphaned children in the past. Second, I have a contact at the Children's Aid Society who owes me a considerable favor from a case I solved involving her brother. She may be willing to expedite placement for the children with vetted families. Third, and perhaps most promising, there is a wealthy widow named Mrs. Adelaide Montgomery who has been seeking a meaningful project to occupy her time since her husband's passing last year." "These all sound promising," Catherine said carefully. "But I must ask, Detective, what becomes of the children in these scenarios? Will they be kept together? Will they be treated with kindness? I have not spent 3 months caring for them only to see them distributed like parcels to strangers who may or may not have their best interests at heart." The fierceness in her voice stirred something warm in Thomas's chest. "Your concern is precisely why I want you intimately involved in every decision we make regarding their futures. No child will be placed anywhere without your approval, Mrs. Winters. I give you my word on that." Catherine's expression softened, and for the first time since entering his office, she seemed to relax slightly. "You are a remarkably unusual man, Detective Ashford. Most in your position would dismiss my opinions as those of a meddling woman who should be grateful for any solution that resolves the problem. Then they would be fools," Thomas said simply. "You know these children better than anyone. You have earned their trust and affection. Your insight is invaluable, not a hindrance." He paused, then added with careful deliberation, "And I find myself valuing your opinions on matters far beyond this immediate situation, Mrs. Winters. You possess a moral clarity that I have rarely encountered." A faint blush colored Catherine's cheeks, and she looked down at her hands. "You flatter me, sir. I am simply doing what any decent person would do. But that is precisely the point. Most people do not do what you do. Most people walk past suffering and tell themselves it is not their responsibility. You stopped and acted, at great personal risk and cost." Thomas found himself leaning forward, drawn by an impulse to make her understand how extraordinary he found her. That requires not just compassion but courage. Before Catherine could respond, another knock sounded at the door. Thomas suppressed a flash of irritation at the interruption. "Enter." A young officer stepped inside, his expression apologetic. "Begging your pardon, Detective Ashford, but Captain Mitchell wishes to see you in his office immediately. He said it concerns the report filed by Officer Davis regarding an incident in an alley last evening." Thomas's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression neutral. "Tell the captain I will be with him shortly." The officer nodded and departed, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Catherine had gone pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "This is because of me, because of what happened last night. It is because of a patrolman who could not resist the opportunity to question a superior officer's judgment," Thomas corrected, rising from his chair. "Wait here, Mrs. Winters. I will resolve this matter and return shortly. Under no circumstances should you leave this office or speak with anyone else in the building. Do you understand?" "Yes, but Detective Ashford, I cannot allow you to sacrifice your position for my sake. If you must tell the truth about what you saw, I will accept the consequences." Thomas moved around his desk, coming to stand before her. Without thinking, he reached out and gently took one of her gloved hands in his, a gesture that would have been considered highly improper in most circumstances, but which felt entirely natural in that moment. "Listen to me very carefully, Catherine. I will not allow harm to come to you or those children. I will handle Captain Mitchell, and then we will proceed with our plan as discussed. Trust me." The use of her given name, unplanned and intimate, hung in the air between them. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, but she did not pull her hand away. Instead, her fingers tightened around his, conveying without words a trust that both frightened and exhilarated him. "I do trust you, Thomas. God help me, but I do." The sound of his name on her lips sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine streaming through the window. For a long moment, they remained thus, hands clasped, eyes locked, the world beyond that small office seeming to recede into insignificance. Then, with visible reluctance, Thomas released her hand and stepped back. "I will return soon. Do not worry." He straightened his coat and left the office, closing the door firmly behind him. Captain Mitchell's office was located on the 3rd floor, a larger and more impressive space befitting his rank. Thomas knocked once and entered at the barked command from within. The captain sat behind a massive oak desk, his weathered face set in stern lines that spoke of decades of dealing with the city's criminal element and the officers sworn to combat it. "Ashford," Mitchell said without preamble, "I have received a rather peculiar report from Officer Davis. He claims you interfered with his attempt to arrest a woman for vagrancy and harboring vagrant children. He further claims you cited an ongoing investigation that neither I nor anyone else in this department has any knowledge of. Would you care to explain yourself?" Thomas had anticipated this confrontation and had prepared his response with the same care he would give to testimony in a courtroom. "Captain, I apologize for the lack of communication regarding this matter. The investigation is of a sensitive nature, and I believe discretion was paramount. However, I should have informed you immediately." "Sensitive nature?" Mitchell's eyebrows rose skeptically. "In what way is a widow feeding vagrant children a matter for the Special Investigations Division?" "Because it reveals a systematic failure in our city's welfare systems, sir. Mrs. Catherine Winters is not a criminal. She is a respectable widow who has been attempting to fill gaps left by inadequate municipal services. In the process of observing her activities, I have documented multiple instances of children falling through the cracks of our existing institutions. Orphanages are overcrowded, the workhouse is inhumane, and private charitable organizations are overwhelmed. This is a matter that reflects poorly on the city's governance and could become a significant public scandal if not addressed properly." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You are suggesting we use this case as leverage for municipal reform? I am suggesting that we conduct a thorough investigation into the treatment and placement of orphaned and abandoned children in Boston, using Mrs. Winters and the 5 children she has been assisting as our primary case study. The findings could be presented to the City Council with recommendations for improvements. It would demonstrate that the police department is not merely interested in enforcement but in addressing root causes of social disorder." The captain was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing the political implications. Thomas waited, maintaining an expression of professional confidence while his heart hammered against his ribs. Everything depended on Mitchell accepting this explanation, on seeing the potential benefits rather than the irregularities.
"This is highly irregular, Ashford," Mitchell said finally. "You should have obtained approval before initiating such an investigation. However, I cannot deny the potential value of what you are proposing. The mayor has been under pressure from reform-minded citizens regarding the treatment of the poor, particularly children. If we can present a comprehensive report with concrete recommendations, it could improve the department's standing with the public." Relief flooded through Thomas, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you, sir. I will ensure the investigation is conducted with the utmost professionalism and that you receive regular updates on our progress." "See that you do. And Ashford, in the future, clear such initiatives with me before proceeding. We cannot have detectives running independent operations without oversight, regardless of how noble the intentions." Mitchell's tone softened slightly. "That said, I appreciate your dedication to this work. It reflects well on the department. You have my permission to continue, but I want a preliminary report on my desk within 2 weeks." "Understood, sir. Thank you." Thomas left the office, allowing himself a small smile of satisfaction, only after the door closed behind him. He had bought them time, transformed a dangerous lie into an official investigation, and secured the captain's support in the process. Now he simply had to deliver results that would justify the faith Mitchell had placed in him. When he returned to his office, he found Catherine standing by the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. She turned at his entrance, her face filled with anxious inquiry. "It is resolved," Thomas said, unable to suppress the note of triumph in his voice. "Captain Mitchell has approved the investigation. We have official sanction to proceed with finding proper solutions for the children." Catherine's hand flew to her chest, her eyes closing briefly as relief washed over her features. "Thank God. I confess I spent your absence imagining all manner of terrible outcomes. I thought perhaps you would return to tell me I must face charges after all, or that the children would be taken immediately. No charges, no immediate actions against the children. We have time now, Catherine. Time to do this properly." Thomas moved to his desk, gesturing for her to resume her seat. As she did so, he noticed the way the afternoon light caught in her hair, creating subtle highlights of auburn and gold that he had not noticed before. He forced himself to focus on the papers before him, rather than the increasingly distracting presence of this remarkable woman. "What are our next steps?" Catherine asked, her practical nature reasserting itself despite the emotional moment. "We begin by meeting with the contacts I mentioned earlier. Mrs. Adelaide Montgomery, the widow I spoke of, has agreed to receive us tomorrow afternoon at her home on Commonwealth Avenue. She is expecting both of us, and I have briefed her on the general circumstances without revealing specific details that might prejudice her opinion." Catherine looked uncertain. "Detective Ashford, I must confess I am not accustomed to moving in such elevated social circles. My late husband was a school teacher, as I mentioned. We lived comfortably but modestly. I fear I may say or do something inappropriate in the presence of such a wealthy woman." Thomas found her concern oddly endearing. This woman who had faced down police officers with courage but was nervous about a social call. "You underestimate yourself, Catherine. Your dignity and intelligence are evident in everything you do. Mrs. Montgomery is not a cruel woman who judges others by their financial circumstances. Indeed, she has specifically requested to meet you after I told her of your dedication to the children. She was quite moved by your story." "You told her about me?" Catherine's eyes widened slightly. "What exactly did you say?" "Only the truth. That you are a widow of limited means who has been providing for orphaned children out of your own resources, at great personal sacrifice and risk. That you possess a rare combination of compassion and practical wisdom. That the children adore you and trust you completely." Thomas paused, then added more softly, "and that I found you to be one of the most admirable people I have had the privilege of encountering." The blush that colored Catherine's cheeks was more pronounced this time, and she looked away, clearly flustered by his words. "You give me far too much credit, Thomas. I am simply doing what my conscience demands, which is precisely what makes you admirable." Thomas realized he was leaning forward again, drawn toward her like iron to a magnet. He forced himself to sit back, to maintain proper professional distance, even as everything in him wanted to close the space between them. "Tomorrow, then. I will call for you at your apartment at 1 o'clock, and we will travel together to Mrs. Montgomery's residence. In the meantime, how are the children? Did you manage to get them settled safely last night?" "Yes, though it was quite late before they finally fell asleep.
They are understandably anxious about what the future holds. Little Emma asked me this morning if the kind detective would truly help us or if it was simply a dream she had conjured in her mind. Catherine's expression grew tender at the mention of the youngest child. She has been through so much, that little one. She barely speaks most days, but she speaks of you. Does she? Thomas felt an unexpected tightness in his chest.
What does she say? She says you have sad eyes but a good heart, that you remind her of her father, though she cannot quite remember his face anymore. It has been too long since she lost him. Catherine's own eyes glistened with moisture. Children possess a remarkable ability to perceive the truth about people, do they not? They see past the facades we construct, straight to the essence of who we are. Then I hope I prove worthy of her faith, Thomas said quietly, and yours as well. You already have, Thomas. The fact that you are doing any of this, that you have risked your career and reputation to help people you barely know, speaks volumes about your character. They fell into a comfortable silence, the sounds of the police headquarters continuing around them but seeming somehow distant and unimportant. Thomas found himself studying Catherine's profile as she gazed out the window once more, memorizing the delicate line of her jaw, the way her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the gentle curve of her lips that he found himself increasingly desperate to taste. The thought startled him with its intensity and inappropriateness. He was supposed to be helping her, not developing romantic feelings that would complicate an already complex situation. And yet, he could not deny what was growing between them, this connection that seemed to deepen with every passing moment they spent in each other's company. "Catherine," he said, his voice rougher than intended. She turned to look at him, her green eyes questioning. "I must confess something to you, and I hope you will forgive my presumption." "What is it?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she sensed the gravity of what he was about to say. "When I saw you in that alley last night, when I watched you caring for those children with such tenderness and dedication, something shifted inside me. I have spent years building walls around my heart, convincing myself that solitude was strength, that emotional distance was necessary for clear judgment. But you have somehow breached those walls in the span of a single evening. I find myself thinking of you constantly, wondering about your welfare, wanting to ensure your happiness in ways that go far beyond professional obligation." He paused, searching her face for any sign of rejection or disgust. "I realize this is terribly inappropriate timing, that I should focus solely on the investigation and the children's welfare. But I could not let another day pass without acknowledging what I feel." Catherine's expression had transformed during his speech, moving through surprise to something softer, warmer, that made Thomas's pulse quicken with hope. "Thomas," she said, his name on her lips sounding like a benediction, "do you truly believe yourself alone in experiencing such feelings? From the moment you stepped forward in that alley, when you chose kindness over duty, protection over arrest, I felt something I thought I would never feel again after my husband's death. I thought my heart had been buried with him, that I would live out my days in solitary devotion to helping others, never again knowing the warmth of affection or the possibility of love. But you have awakened something in me, something I feared was lost forever." Thomas rose from his chair, moving around the desk until he stood before her. Catherine stood as well, and they faced each other in the golden afternoon light, the world seeming to hold its breath around them. "I hardly dare to believe this is real," Thomas said, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hand. "That I have found you, that you exist at all, seems almost too miraculous to credit. Yet here I stand," Catherine replied, her hand rising to cover his where it rested against her cheek. "As real as you are, as real as the feelings growing between us." Thomas drew her closer, his other arm encircling her waist, and Catherine came willingly into his embrace. For a long moment, they simply stood thus, holding each other, taking comfort and strength from their physical proximity. Then, slowly, carefully, as if approaching something precious and fragile, Thomas lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question asked and answered without words. But as Catherine's arms wound around his neck, as she pressed closer against him, the kiss deepened into something more profound, more passionate. Years of loneliness seemed to melt away in that embrace, replaced by connection, understanding, and the promise of something beautiful growing between them. When they finally separated, both were breathless, their foreheads resting together as they struggled to regain their composure. "We should not have done that," Catherine said,
though her tone suggested she harbored no real regret. "It is improper, scandalous even." "Perhaps," Thomas agreed, "but I find I care very little for propriety at this moment. I care only that you are here, that you return my feelings, and that we face whatever comes next together." A knock at the door interrupted them, causing both to step apart hastily. Thomas called permission to enter, and a clerk appeared with a message. "Detective Ashford, Mrs. Montgomery's secretary has sent word that she wishes to move tomorrow's meeting to this evening instead, if that is convenient. She has had a cancellation in her schedule and is eager to discuss your investigation." Thomas glanced at Catherine, who nodded despite the sudden change in plans. "Tell Mrs. Montgomery we accept her invitation. We will arrive at 6 o'clock this evening." After the clerk departed, Catherine pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. "This evening? Thomas, I am not properly dressed for such a visit. This is my best dress, but it is still morning attire, and rather worn besides." "You look perfect," Thomas assured her, meaning every word. "Mrs. Montgomery will not judge you by your clothing, Catherine. She will see what I see, a woman of grace, intelligence, and extraordinary compassion." He checked his pocket watch. "We have 3 hours before we must leave. May I suggest we collect the children and bring them to meet Mrs. Montgomery as well? She expressed interest in seeing them, and I believe their presence will help her understand the urgency and importance of our cause." Catherine considered this proposal, then nodded decisively. "Yes, that is an excellent idea. The children should be part of this process. They deserve to have a voice in decisions that affect their futures." She paused, a worry line appearing between her brows. "But Thomas, what if she finds them too rough, too wild?" "They are good children, but they lack the polish of those raised in comfortable circumstances. Then she will see them as they truly are, children who deserve better than life has given them thus far. Come, let us go together to fetch them. We have much to accomplish before this evening." The remainder of the afternoon passed in a flurry of activity. Thomas and Catherine made their way to her modest apartment on Charles Street, where the 5 children were waiting anxiously for news. Their faces lit up when they saw Thomas accompanying Catherine, and little Emma ran forward to grasp his hand with touching trust. "Are you here to take us away?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt at bravery. Thomas knelt down to address all 5 children at eye level. "I am here to help find you proper homes where you will be safe, warm, well-fed, and most importantly, loved. Mrs. Winters and I have been working very hard to ensure your futures are bright. Tonight we are going to meet a very kind lady who may be able to help us. I need all of you to be on your best behavior, to answer questions honestly, and to trust that we have your best interests at heart. Can you do that?" 5 heads nodded in solemn agreement, and Thomas felt his heart swell with affection for these brave little souls. Catherine set about preparing the children for the visit, washing faces and hands, combing hair, and doing her best to make their worn clothing look presentable. Thomas watched her work with quiet admiration, noting the gentle way she spoke to each child, the patient manner in which she addressed their fears and questions. By 5:30, they were ready to depart. Thomas had arranged for a large carriage to transport their unusual group, and the children's excitement at riding in such a fine conveyance was palpable. Even their nervousness could not entirely suppress their wonder at this unexpected adventure. Mrs. Adelaide Montgomery's home on Commonwealth Avenue was a magnificent brownstone that spoke of substantial wealth and refined taste. As their carriage pulled up before the entrance, Catherine gripped Thomas's hand tightly, her nervousness returning. "Are you certain this is the right course?" she whispered. "I am certain," Thomas replied firmly, squeezing her hand in reassurance. "Trust in yourself, Catherine. Trust in these children, and trust in me." They were received by a dignified butler, who showed them into an elegant sitting room where Mrs. Montgomery awaited. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, dressed in expensive but tasteful attire, her silver hair arranged in a fashionable style. But it was her eyes that captured Thomas's attention, warm brown eyes that held genuine kindness rather than the cold calculation he had seen in so many of Boston's wealthy elite. "Detective Ashford," she greeted him warmly, extending her hand. "And this must be Mrs. Winters. My dear, I have heard so much about your remarkable efforts on behalf of these children." She turned her attention to the 5 young ones clustered nervously behind Catherine. "And these are the children themselves. Come, my dears, do not be frightened. I may live in a large house, but I promise I do not bite." Her gentle humor eased some of the tension, and Sarah, ever the brave one, stepped forward. Good evening, ma'am. My name is Sarah Miller, and these are my friends Michael, Robert, William, and Emma. We are very pleased to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Montgomery's face softened with obvious emotion. Such lovely manners, child. Please, all of you, sit down. I have had cook prepare some refreshments. There are sandwiches and cakes and lemonade for the children. What followed was one of the most extraordinary evenings of Thomas's life. Mrs. Montgomery proved to be not only wealthy but genuinely compassionate, asking the children about their lives, their hopes, their fears, with sincere interest and no condescension. She drew out even shy Emma, who eventually climbed into the woman's lap and nestled there with touching trust. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Montgomery spoke privately with Thomas and Catherine while the children explored her garden under the watchful eye of her housekeeper. "I have been wealthy all my life," she confided, "but it is only since my husband's death that I have truly understood how empty wealth can be without purpose. These children, Mrs. Winters, your dedication to them, Detective Ashford's willingness to help, all of this has awakened something in me that I feared had died with my dear Henry." "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Montgomery?" Thomas asked, hardly daring to hope. "I am suggesting that my home is far too large for one lonely widow. I am suggesting that I have resources, education, and time that could be put to far better use than hosting tedious social functions. I am suggesting, Detective Ashford, Mrs. Winters, that I would like to become these children's guardian, to provide them with a proper home, education, and opportunities they would never have otherwise." She paused, her eyes moving between Thomas and Catherine with obvious perception. "And I am suggesting that you two have found something quite precious in each other, something that should be nurtured and allowed to flourish." Catherine gasped softly, her hand finding Thomas's beneath the table. "Mrs. Montgomery, I cannot possibly accept such generosity. It is too much." "Nonsense, my dear. It is not nearly enough. But I have one condition." Mrs. Montgomery's expression grew more serious. "I am not a young woman, and these children will need younger people in their lives, people who understand their struggles and can guide them as they grow. I would like you, Mrs. Winters, to serve as their primary caregiver, living here with them, ensuring continuity in their lives. And you, Detective Ashford, I would like you to serve as a sort of guardian uncle, visiting regularly, maintaining your investigation to ensure other children in similar circumstances receive help as well." Thomas looked at Catherine, seeing his own amazement and hope reflected in her eyes. "Mrs. Montgomery, your offer is extraordinarily generous, but I must ask, are you certain? 5 children represent a tremendous responsibility." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Detective. These children need love, stability, and opportunity. I can provide all 3. And unless I am very much mistaken, you and Mrs. Winters need the freedom to pursue what is clearly developing between you without the constant weight of worry about these little ones' welfare." Over the next hour, they discussed the practical arrangements. Mrs. Montgomery would formally petition the courts to become the children's legal guardian, with Thomas's investigation providing the necessary documentation to expedite the process. Catherine would move into the brownstone with the children, occupying a suite of rooms on the 3rd floor, with a generous salary for her services as governess and caregiver. The children would receive proper educations, medical care, and all the advantages of growing up in a loving, stable environment. When they finally departed that evening, the children were ecstatic, chattering excitedly about their new home, their new rooms, the garden where they could play. Catherine walked beside Thomas in stunned silence, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, both of them processing the miraculous turn their lives had taken. "I can hardly believe this is real," Catherine said as they walked slowly through the lamplit streets. The children had gone ahead with Mrs. Montgomery's housekeeper to begin settling into their new home, leaving Thomas and Catherine alone for the first time since their kiss in his office. 2 days ago, I was living in constant fear of discovery, struggling to feed 5 hungry mouths on a pittance. Now those children have a future beyond anything I could have dreamed for them. You gave them that future, Catherine. Your love, your dedication, your refusal to turn away from their suffering, all of that led to this moment. Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her in the glow of a street lamp. "And you have given me something as well. Something I did not know I was missing until I found it." "What is that?" Catherine asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "Hope, purpose, The possibility of love and companionship after years of solitary existence. Thomas took both her hands in his. Catherine Winters, I know we have known each other for only 2 days. I know that by all conventional standards, we should wait, should court properly over months or even years before speaking of such things. But I find I cannot wait. Life is too short, too uncertain, and what I feel for you is too strong to deny. I love you. I believe I began loving you the moment I saw you in that alley, sacrificing everything for children who were not even your own. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears streamed down Catherine's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. Oh, Thomas. Yes. 1,000 times yes. I love you with all my heart, and I want nothing more than to spend my life with you, building something beautiful together. Thomas pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion and tenderness he had been suppressing, not caring who might see them or what scandal might result. In that moment, beneath the Boston street lamps, with the promise of a new life stretching before them, nothing else mattered but the woman in his arms and the love they had found in the most unexpected of circumstances. 3 months later, on a crisp January morning in 1898, Thomas Ashford and Catherine Winters were married in a small ceremony at the Church of the Advent. Mrs. Adelaide Montgomery served as Catherine's matron of honor, and 5 children who had once been homeless and forgotten sat in the front pew, their faces shining with joy as they watched the 2 people who had saved them pledge their lives to each other. Thomas's investigation had indeed led to significant reforms in Boston's welfare systems, with new protections for orphaned children and increased funding for charitable organizations. He had been promoted to senior detective, his career enhanced rather than damaged by his unorthodox methods. But more importantly, he had found a family where he had least expected it, in a courageous widow and 5 children who had taught him that true justice sometimes meant breaking rules to honor a higher law. As Thomas kissed his bride, as Catherine's eyes sparkled with happiness and hope, as 5 children cheered from their seats, he reflected on the words he had spoken that night in the alley. I understand, he had said, and he had meant it then. But only now did he truly comprehend the full depth of what he had understood, that love and compassion were not weaknesses, but the greatest strengths any person could possess, that true happiness came not from solitary achievement, but from connection, sacrifice, and the courage to let others into one's heart. The detective and the widow walked from the church hand in hand, ready to face whatever adventures life might bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face them together. And behind them, 5 children, who had once known only hunger and fear, now knew love, security, and the promise of a future bright with possibility. In the end, it had all begun with a single act of kindness, a loaf of bread shared in a dark alley, and 2 lonely souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become whole. Some might call it coincidence or luck, but Thomas and Catherine knew better. They called it destiny, and they called it love, and they called it the beginning of the rest of their beautifully imperfect, perfectly wonderful lives.